Let's begin with the word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful, Lord, once again for the end of this week of study in trying to understand the foundation of this message, to have a clear understanding of it. And we just ask, Lord, for your Holy Spirit to guide this study this morning, to help each person to grasp the things that are being discussed, and help me, Lord, in presenting this message as well. We pray that your truth can continue to grow, that your message will go to the world, and that we can be instruments of yours. And thank you for hearing our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So, first thing, I'm going to bring up, share the screen here. And I mentioned in one of the studies just about the background, and it's this book, Jack Secera's Beyond Belief, which I think was published in 1993, and it created a stir among conservative Adventists. He was with the 1888 Message Study Committee, and what he was presenting, there was 2 points, one on forensic justification and the other on universal justification. So these 2 points were in error, but they really permeated his belief. Also in, I have Whelan's defense of this, and then as well, Jack Secera was, there's the teachings of Jack Secera by, I can't think of his name. People should be able to recognize from Pilgrim's Rest. Who's the guy with Pilgrim's Rest? What's his name? Vance Farrell.
Vance Farrell.
Yeah, so this is Vance Farrell's survey of a lot of the errors that we see in Jack Secera. His view on the spirit of prophecy, his belief that there was only one compartment in the heavenly sanctuary, the ideas regarding corporate guilt, which is something that I disagree with the 1888 Message Study Committee regarding. I don't believe in corporate guilt, because that takes a guilt as something away from the individual, and it's something that we and it's difficult, because when you look at the word guilt, it depends what people mean by guilt. So the belief in corporate guilt is an issue, and then the areas of righteousness by faith, the Sabbath, and the final crisis, all these different views that Jack Secera had. Now, I don't always trust Vance Farrell, so Vance Farrell can twist things quite a bit as well. But he does give some background information. Anytime you have an article like this, you need to check out for yourself whether what that person's saying is correct, whether he's representing things correctly, because we all can say things that somebody can take out of context. So I always give caution in that area. But I will send people these documents. Now, the study today, the third article, which is, I guess it's entitled History and Transition. This article is a little longer than the one that we did yesterday, and it's going to take more than today to get through it, because we're now getting into a more detailed study of Daniel chapter 11. And we know what happened with our understanding of Daniel chapter 11, as we started to see that it wasn't just the repeat of verses 30 to 36 that were happening, but that the whole issue of the king of the north and the king of the south, and even the beginning of Daniel chapter 11, dealing with the history of the kings of Persia, all of these were being repeated in our history. And we came to the conclusion that Trump would be the last president of the United States, and we're still sticking to that view, even though we have Biden as president, recognizing that a change has happened with the Biden presidency that we would have to characterize as the globalists have taken over the United States and that republicanism has fallen. Now, of course, looking at current events and the response to that or the backlash, if somebody's reading or watching what's happening within republicanism, the Republicans are still trying to hold on to the party and are still clinging to Trump. And many people feel that that will be the end of the Republican Party. And we have a comparison which we have in Alberta politics. So we used to have a Alberta, so this is a province in Canada, where we have premiers, and we had a premier of our province. He was a minister, and the party was the Social Credit Party, which doesn't sound like a great name for a political party. And trying to think of his name. Can't think of it offhand, but it'll come back when I'm not thinking of it. And what ended up happening is the Social Credit Party continued to cling to ideas, and we had a party then called the Progressive Conservative Party, a rather ironic name. And the Progressive Conservatives were actually the Conservative Party and the Progressive Party that combined. And that Progressive Conservative Party became the ruling party in Alberta for 30 some years, for a long time. But the point is that you could see a party that tried to hold on to something. So the Social Credit Party still tried to hold on to the values that they had, but those values were changing in the society around them. And this is what I see in the United States, is that the values that we once held on to, things like free speech, all the principles of the Constitution, those things have been abandoned. And they've been abandoned for a long time by a large majority of people. But it comes to the point where there's just so many people who have no interest in the values that Trump presented. That right now we have, of course, this division. I wouldn't say that you have an overwhelming majority of people who are liberals, but you definitely have enough. And as we keep moving on, our hope would be, from a human point of view, that people would see how silly the Democrats are, and that after 4 years of the Democrats, things are going to be so bad that we would take Trump back, or even republicanism back with Trump behind the party, something like that. That's what people are sort of hoping for. But I think that the change is permanent. I don't think that you can go back to Trump, and that what you're going to see unfold in the battle for the mind is just going to accelerate. I don't think we're going to have a reprieve from this destruction of society that has occurred, this social experiment that has really undermined the foundation or fabric of society. So I don't think there is any turning back. I think that Trump was really, in a sense, the last gasp for those values. And he lost that battle to the globalists. That's my view, my opinion, but I could be wrong. So anyway, as we're going to look at this history and transition, this series here, now what he's going to start to look at after he had looked at the Millerite history, is just to go over past histories and those that are expressed in Daniel chapter 11. So let's begin reading here. It says, in the first two articles of this series, we presented evidence which demonstrates that God has counseled us to understand history. In past ages, God's people have been destroyed because of a lack of knowledge. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because thou hast rejected knowledge. Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee. Thou shalt be no priest to me, seeing thou hast forgotten the law of thy God. I will also forget thy children. Now that's from the book of Hosea, chapter 4, verse 6. What was the lack of knowledge that God's people were destroyed for? What's the context of Hosea chapter 4? Anybody know?
They rejected knowledge.
Okay, but what kind of knowledge was it? What's the context of the knowledge if you read in Hosea chapter 4? Okay, let's look at that. Okay, it's Hosea chapter 4. Hear the word of the Lord, ye children of Israel, for the Lord hath a controversy with the inhabitants of the land, because there is no truth, nor mercy, nor knowledge of God in the land. By swearing and lying and killing and stealing and committing adultery, they break out, and blood toucheth blood. So what's the issue? What's the lack of knowledge causing, or what is this lack of knowledge?
Of his law?
Yeah, of his law, right? So they're manifesting sin. So when we deal with something like what he's talking about here, the lack of knowledge of history, how is that related? Because, Jeff is referring to knowledge here, dealing with the knowledge about history. Okay, I heard some sounds there, but I don't know who was talking. So what is this knowledge?
Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah, okay, so that's the way Jeff is applying it. So the question is, how is that related to the lack of knowledge of God's law? Because Hosea is talking about the lack of knowledge of God's law that results in open sin. Jeff is applying this verse to address the lack of knowledge of history. Are they related? Is this a misapplication of this verse on Jeff's part, is what I'm asking.
No, I think it's a good analogy.
Okay, how so? Can you explain why?
Those who forget God's law fall under condemnation and wrath. History repeats.
Okay, so in history, we can see these examples. So when Jeff here is just talking about history, it's not just history for history's sake. It's because in history, we can see demonstrated again and again what happens when people depart from God's law. That would be the point. But somebody just reading on the surface would say, well, Jeff took this out of context. So Jeff goes on, he says, at least part of the knowledge which will protect us as we approach these final hours of Earth's history is a knowledge of the past. In the second article, we focused on the history which transpired during the first and second angels' messages of 1843 to 44. We identified this experience as prefiguring the final revival of the latter rain. So he's taking Millerite history as a type of our history. In this article, we will look at a time in history which has also been identified as necessary for our understanding. This history is directly associated with the primary focus of our study, the final 6 verses of Daniel 11. In preparation for this article, we closed the previous article with the following passage. We have no time to lose. Troublous times are before us. The world is stirred with the spirit of war. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. The prophecy in the 11th chapter of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Much of the history that has taken place in fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. In the 30th verse, a power is spoken of that shall be grieved. And then Daniel 11, verse 30 to 36 is quoted. Scenes similar to those described in these words will take place. We see evidence that Satan is fast obtaining the control of human minds who have not the fear of God before them. Let all read and understand the prophecies of this book, for we are now entering upon the time of troubles spoken of. And then she quotes Daniel 12, 1-4. And that's from Manuscript Releases, Volume 13, 394. All emphasis, he says, is supplied unless otherwise stated. So Sister White identifies the historical fulfillment of Daniel 11 as something which we should expect to see repeated as the complete fulfillment of Daniel 11 unfolds. So this idea here is that you're taking earlier history in Daniel 11, and that earlier history is repeated in connection with the final verses of Daniel 11 as they unfold. They're not repeated, but certain aspects of part of Daniel 11 are repeated in that history. Now, this really wasn't fully understood by this movement until when? When did we really grasp this idea? 2015, 2016 that we started to.
Yeah, I think it was the December 2016.
December 2016? Okay. Well, we already had started with that Trump was the last president. So we had Daniel chapter 11, verse 1-4 open up prior to Raphi and Panium opening up, right? And so this kind of unfolded in this movement, starting in 2015, going into 2016, and then in 2017, when it was really presented to everyone. But it happened gradually. It took us a while to see that all of Daniel repeats. And it wasn't until January 11th, 2020, that Jeff felt that in watching a presentation by Daniel Fontenot, that we now had the correct understanding of Daniel 11, that we could see the whole thing. And we're going to get to that, to some of the changes later on that Jeff saw in our understanding of Daniel 11. Now, that history is a little bit clouded because there were many different voices with many different interpretations of Daniel 11 once we started to see that history was repeated. And so we had Parminder, who wasn't really accepting this, though he wasn't stating it. We had some of the groups out of Africa presenting an understanding of Daniel 11, some of the verses. I'm trying to remember who else. Well, we had Chawatu's view. So this was coming out of the UK. So another view. And then other, minor differences that people were having regarding Daniel chapter 11. So these things were all unfolding in that history. And even though Jeff states that on January 11th, 2020, that we had come to that understanding, I don't think that most of us could say exactly what it was that Jeff saw. So to get to that point, I think we need to sort of review. That's one of the reasons we're reviewing all of this history, is to get up to speed of where we should be. Now, Sister White identifies the historical fulfillment of Daniel 11 as something we should expect to see repeated in the complete fulfillment, right? So this complete fulfillment of Daniel 11 unfolds. She highlights Daniel 11, 30-36. So these are the verses. And I think that we at least understood that much, that 30-36 was going to be repeated. But that all of Daniel 11 would be repeated was what we didn't fully understand. The pioneers and Sister White understood that Daniel 11 was fulfilled from verse 1 through the first phase of verse 40. which brings us up to 1798, the time of the end. Therefore, when Sister White speaks of the complete fulfillment of Daniel 11, she is speaking of verses 40 to 45, directing us to scenes and history which will be repeated. She isolates the history of these verses further by quoting Daniel 12, 1 to 4. Sister White clearly recognized the standing up of Michael in Daniel 12, 1 as being the close of probation. The complete fulfillment of verses 40 to 45 takes us from 1798 to the Battle of Armageddon. During the events described in these verses, Michael stands up, closing his mediatorial work and human probation. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book, Daniel 12:1. When the time of trouble comes, every case is decided. There's no longer probation, no longer mercy for the impenitent. The seal of the living God is upon his people. This small remnant, unable to defend themselves in the deadly conflict with the powers of earth that are marshaled by the dragon host, make God their defense. The decree that has been passed by the highest earthly authority, that they shall worship the beast and receive his mark under pain of persecution and death. So the decree has been passed by the highest authority. May God help his people now, for what can they then do in such a fearful conflict without his assistance? So that's Testimonies, Volume 5, 2012, 2013. Not 2012, 212, 213. Used to say years. Okay, it is within the time frame from 1798 to beyond the close of probation that we should expect to see repeated scenes similar and much of the history prophesied to take place in Daniel 11, especially the scenes of history associated with Daniel 11, 30 to 36. Let us briefly review the historical fulfillment of Daniel 11. So he's going to go through Daniel 11, which is quite a study for an article.
There's a lot of confusion yet over 30 to 36 is still confused by a lot of people.
Right, and so we addressed that. Basically, Uriah Smith brought in that confusion, but there's many different interpretations of these portions of Daniel 11, 30 to 36, not just 40 to 45. And it's the understanding of 30 to 36 that actually helps us to correctly understand 40 to 45. And we addressed that a little bit earlier on. The vision of Daniel 11 begins with the kingdom of Medo-Persia being defeated by Alexander the Great. In verse 4, we see Alexander's kingdom divided into 4 parts for his 4 generals. So we know about the first part, he's kind of skipping over, but that's really the history of, he mentions it here. It begins with the kingdom of Medo-Persia being defeated by Alexander the Great. But the part that we came to understand in more detail was the 3 kings are still going to stand up in Persia, and then the 4th would be far richer than they all. This wasn't really seen as significant. I mean, it was just part of that history. So they're not even focusing upon that. And I think the understanding of that was really the key to unlock all of Daniel 11. So anyway, we see Alexander's kingdom divided into 4 parts for his 4 generals. From verse 5 onward, only 2 of his generals are mentioned. These 2 kings were Seleucus and Ptolemy. Their interaction begins a story of the ongoing struggle for world dominion, recorded throughout the rest of Daniel 11. This power struggle is prophetically portrayed as the battle between the king of the north and the king of the south. And it's interesting here. I mean, we know this about Daniel 11, but it wasn't until much later that we understood that all of these battles between the king of the north and the king of the south added detail to our history. One important point of this story is how the scriptures identify the king of the north and south. By comparing recorded history with the testimony of Daniel 11, historians and pioneers discovered that the king of the north was the kingdom which controlled the geographical area of Babylon. They discovered also that the king of the south was the kingdom that controlled the geographical area of Egypt. This principle in Daniel 11 brings together the testimony of scripture with the record of history. This geographical key is the rule which we will apply to Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, as we begin to identify who are the kings of the north and south. This historical truth is no doubt, or one of the clues which the spirit of prophecy intended to direct us to at the time when this prophecy was to come to its complete fulfillment. So this geographical key, how did Uriah Smith misapply this geographical key? Or did he misapply it? We discussed this before. What was the problem with Uriah Smith in his trying to understand the king of the north and the king of the south?
He was being way too literal.
Okay, he's being too literal. So we see these battles between the king of the north and the king of the south that are described in Daniel 11. Which history, where does that lead up to? Is that after the time of Christ or before?
Smith was applying it before.
Right, so, well, we do have the king of the north and the king of the south existing before. So this is a battle between Greece. Greece, of course, is out of the way. Rome comes along. Rome takes over this territory. It becomes the king of the north. So that geographical key still applies. When does the geographical key cease to apply? Why don't we still follow this geographical key? Why wouldn't we argue that the nation that occupies Babylon is still the king of the north, and the nation that occupies Egypt is still the king of the south? Why would we not still use that geographical key?
This may be a misapplication, but I've always taken it that before the cross, literal, after the cross, figurative.
Yeah, and that's the way that I would apply it. So we would see that what happens, and even if you're not saying after the cross, you would still at least say that Babylon presently is not, any prophecies that are talking about Babylon at the end of the world are not talking about literal Babylon. Any prophecies talking about Egypt at the end of the world or Sodom at the end of the world are not talking about literal Egypt and literal Sodom. These are talking, they're using this past history as symbols. So that's what we would call spiritual. It's a spiritual application, taking the past history and these symbols and applying it at the present. So if you were going to say that the king of the north at the time of the end was the nation occupying Babylon, and the king of the south at the time of the end is the nation occupying Egypt, what are you saying about who Babylon is? Could you then could you mix this literal and spiritual and be consistent in your application?
No.
No, you couldn't. And this was the issue that Jeff had when he saw people interpreting Daniel 11, is that they were mixing these elements together. And he wasn't sure of his interpretation of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, when he first saw this presented. But he knew that by mixing this literal and spiritual together, they were ignoring that principle that you talked about, Dwight, that before the cross, literal, after the cross, spiritual. So through the first 13 verses, so he's going to go back, look at this. We find the ebb and flow of history described as different kingdoms rose and fell. In verse 14, we see the primary subject of all Daniel 11 identified for the first time in the vision by the phrase, robbers of thy people. This verse states that these robbers will establish the vision. Uriah Smith addresses this phrase in verse 14 with the following observation: to establish the vision, the Romans, more than any other people, are the subject of Daniel's prophecy. Their first interference in the affairs of these kingdoms is here referred to as being the establishment or demonstration of the truth of the vision, which predicted the existence of such a power. That's Daniel and Revelation, page 244. From this point on, the vision portrays the history of either pagan or papal Rome. In verse 20, we find pagan Rome summons Joseph to pay taxes in Bethlehem. In verse 22, pagan Rome breaks the Prince of the Covenant by crucifying Christ. In verse 24, we see pagan Rome's time of dominion set forth within a biblical time prophecy. The last phrase of this verse sets forth 360 years as the time when pagan Rome would rule the world by the words, even for a time. Uriah Smith concurs with other pioneers and historians on the starting and ending point for this time prophecy. The battle was fought September 2nd, 31 BC, at the mouth of the Gulf of Ambracia, near the city of Actium. The world was at stake. The battle doubtless marks the beginning of the time mentioned in verse 24, as during this time, devices were to be forecast from the stronghold, or Rome. We should conclude that at the end of that period, Western supremacy would cease, or such a change would take place in the empire that that city would no longer be considered the seat of government. From 31 BC, a prophetic time, or 360 years, would bring us to AD 330, pardon me. Hence, it becomes a noteworthy fact that the seat of the empire was removed from Rome to Constantinople by Constantine the Great in that very year. So you can see the point here is this stronghold, or Rome, this is given for a time. And when Constantine moves the capital, he ends up fulfilling this time prophecy of 360 years. So this is well established. We would still understand this as a correct interpretation of Daniel 11. Pagan Rome's 360 years to rule the world had its counterpart with Papal Rome's 1260-year time prophecy. More important to our study, though, is that the dominions of pagan Rome, dominance of pagan Rome, comes to its end just as the verses especially highlighted by Sister White begin. Verses 30 to 36 deal with the history covering the transition from pagan to papal Rome. Now, this is an important point. We see this in Daniel chapter 8. What's the difference between the transition from pagan to papal Rome in Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 11? What's the difference in context? I don't know if people know what I'm asking.
I think you're asking a little bit in advance of understanding.
Okay, so, well, we dealt with the daily. The daily moves from, the daily is pagan. It's the pagan desolation, right? So if you go to Daniel chapter 8, we have this little horn power, right? So we have, the ram and then the goat with the notable horn, which is Alexander, and that horn is broken, right? It goes to the four winds of heaven. And then you're going to have this little horn come out of one of the winds. And he's in verse 11, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. And we're going to see in verse 10, and it waxed great. So this horn is both pagan Rome and papal Rome. When it's pagan Rome, it's referred to in the masculine. When it's papal Rome, it's referred to in the neuter or feminine, right? So it's changing genders back and forth. And now Ellen White addresses this daily in The Great Controversy, but she doesn't address it from here. Which verses does she use to address the transition from pagan to papal Rome? What passage of scripture does she use instead of Daniel 8 or Daniel 11 in the Great Controversy?
Isn't she going into Thessalonians?
Yeah, so 2 Thessalonians. So we know that there's a parallel between this transition, because it was 2 Thessalonians that gave William Miller the key to understanding what was happening in the book of Daniel. And that's because it was well established prophetic understanding of 2 Thessalonians, that the power there, the man of sin, the son of perdition, was the papacy, and that the power that was restraining him was pagan Rome. So when he looked at the verses in Daniel that dealt with him being taken out of the way, he saw that the one that had to be taken out of the way was pagan Rome to make room for papal Rome. Now, when you look at Daniel chapter 8, though, and Daniel 11, what's the difference between these? That is, Daniel chapter 8 is dealing with what aspect of the transition?
You're asking what aspect beyond the change from the feminine to the masculine, back and forth? What aspect are you really referring to?
Okay, when we look at it here, the focus here is on worship, the sanctuary, correct?
Agreed.
Okay, so Daniel chapter 8 is focused upon the sanctuary, or the religious aspect of this transition. That is, it's looking at how the religious aspect of paganism is transitioned or moves into this religious aspect of papalism, right? Because the sanctuary, the place of his sanctuary is addressed, that is Rome's sanctuary, and also God's sanctuary. So this is dealing with the religious counterfeit. When you're looking at Daniel chapter 11, it's addressing the political aspects, right? Not the religious. Would you agree with that?
That's possible. I was looking at what you're referring to out of Daniel 8:10 and reading the other cross-referenced verses.
Okay. Yeah, because we had a little bit of a discussion on this. I wouldn't call it a discussion. You mentioned it in an email. So one of the things you look at when you, because I've studied a lot of old Protestant writers, the understandings of Antiochus Epiphanes. So the Millerites took the position that Antiochus Epiphanes is not the one who's addressed as the abomination of desolation. Now we know that Desmond Ford took a position on Daniel chapter 8 and other places. He called it the telesematic, I can't remember, I don't know how to pronounce it. But this teleo, what's the word?
Apotelesmatic principle.
Apotelesmatic principle, is that what it is? That's just fancy. You're pretty good with words there, Pat. So this idea that it was actually Antiochus Epiphanes who fulfilled this prophecy, and he becomes a type of what happens later on, and that Adventists made a mistake in discounting the interpretation of Antiochus Epiphanes. Now we also saw Parminder introduce this idea as well. So he took the position that Antiochus Epiphanes actually fulfills this prophecy. Now, there's a number of problems with that. So one is the words of Jesus, when you shall see the abomination of desolation as spoken by Daniel the prophet. Jesus is putting that in the future. I think, though, that there is a typical aspect to Antiochus Epiphanes, but I wouldn't put him as a fulfillment of the prophecy. That is, he foreshadows the papacy, but he is not the fulfillment of the prophecy directly. Would anybody disagree with me on that?
Ford really got people to stumble over that because he said we need Reformation theology. That was pure, but that was only one step out of Catholicism.
Right. And
People like the word Reformation theology.
yeah, well, I don't particularly, but yeah. So the idea, though, that Antiochus Epiphanes, because what Dwight is referencing is that the translators of the King James Version, they reference the Book of Maccabees in context with these verses. Correct, Dwight? Is that what you're saying?
That's part of it, yes.
Yeah. And so I would argue that what the history of Antiochus Epiphanes, even though it's not the fulfillment of these verses, it has some of the same aspects. That is, history does repeat itself. And the history of the Maccabees, I think, is an important history of what happened in that time. Now, Miller addresses that history as well, but he's quite clear that Antiochus Epiphanes is not the one that's being represented here by the little horn. So if you were trying to say, if a person was trying to argue that the little horn here that comes out of Greece is Antiochus Epiphanes, how does that undo our understanding of the book of Daniel?
Takes the focus away from Rome.
Right, it takes the focus away from Rome. And that's one of the reasons I believe Parminder was introducing that Antiochus Epiphanes was the fulfillment. Because we see it again and again when people, because it's pretty clear if you take Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, and then you look at Daniel chapter 8, these prophecies that are addressing these histories, that the little horn power has to be Rome. Because if it's Rome in Daniel chapter 2, the last power, and it's Rome in Daniel chapter 7, we consistently have to say that it's Rome in Daniel chapter 8.
Okay, so to be able to look at this directly, if we look at Daniel 8:9,
Yeah,
it reads, "And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great, toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land." Right?
yeah,
Now, the translators used, when they're looking at this on the little horn, they use Daniel 11:25 as their primary reference. "And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him." Now, Daniel 8:9 says that this little horn waxed exceeding great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land.
yeah. The glorious land is the pleasant land. Yeah,
Okay. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes, who was one of the Seleucid rulers, one of the four,
yeah,
we can agree that he went against the king of the south.
yeah. Egypt.
Right, because First Maccabees 1 verses, I think it's 16 to 20, details how he wanted to rule over two dominions.
Mhm.
And I think we can agree that he went against the glorious land or the pleasant land.
Yeah.
But where was it that he went against the east?
I can't see that he did.
Right. So he didn't fulfill this part of it.
Yeah.
So with that one part being removed, Antiochus Epiphanes cannot be the king of the north.
Hmm.
Now, here again, yes, I will have my battle with those that wish to believe that Uriah Smith was a prophet. I deal with that in my area all of the time, especially with some very dear friends.
Yeah.
I just want nothing to do with it because I don't see that Uriah Smith, with all the warnings that Mrs. White gave,
Yeah.
was capable of fully understanding what was going on in this portion of scripture.
Hmm.
Now,
Right. So now dealing with Daniel chapter 8,
right.
my focus here is that there is this feminine and masculine fluctuation. So we know that the little horn represents um, both pagan and papal Rome, but it's in their religious aspects. Because when we look at this chapter, what do we see? We see sanctuary animals, though they're deformed, so they're unfit for service. A ram with one horn bigger than the other, that's not a perfect ram. It can't be offered in the sanctuary. So these are counterfeit religion. It's dealing with paganism itself.
It's
And then you see,
imperfect worship.
yeah, and then you see uh, a goat with one horn between his eyes, and then that horn's going to break into four horns, and then he's going to have this other horn grow up. So you can see that goat, even though it's a sanctuary animal, is unfit to be offered. And so when then we have this little horn power, this is again a religious power. So Daniel 8 is addressing the religious aspects of the transition from pagan to papal Rome. But when we look at Daniel chapter 11, it's addressing the political change that occurs. So it is still connected with the taking away of the daily, but this one's connected with the daily moving from pagan to papal Rome. That is, it's paganism in Christian garb, right? So he, when it says he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, that's referring to pagan Rome. And from him, from pagan Rome, the daily or paganism was lifted up and exalted as a heave offering, and the place of his sanctuary was set up. So it was set up in the place of his sanctuary. The place of his sanctuary is in Rome. And so the papacy received the seat of pagan Rome. That's the way that I understand this. And when it says a host was given him, the him is an added word against the daily. So now papal Rome is going to get an army or power. By reason of transgression, it cast down the truth to the ground, it practiced and prospered. This is the setting up. It does mention, of course, the military power here, but it's so that it can set up its false system of worship. So this is really a parallel to Revelation chapter 13. That's the way that I understand it. So then it's going to address this whole issue. How long shall be the vision concerning the daily and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? this then gives us the context to understand the 2300 days is ending in Millerite history and not in the history of Antiochus Epiphanes. Because those that say this is Antiochus Epiphanes, like Desmond Ford, would then apply the 2300 days to 1115 days, and representing a period, slightly around 3 years for Antiochus Epiphanes. So in doing that, that's a preterist view. And then he would only apply it sort of as a secondary application. But I would say that the primary application here has to be the way that Miller understood it regarding the daily. So anyway, we got to get back to the paper here, just get some of that background. So we know that the point of Rome establishes the vision. And then you have this period, this time, and this 360 years, pagan Rome's 360 years to rule the world, had its counterpart in papal Rome's 1260 year period. So we can see that pagan Rome becomes a type of papal Rome. This is another important point. So this transition from pagan to papal Rome is what's happening in verse 30 to 36. Sister White goes on, the time appointed is probably the prophetic time, or this isn't Ellen White, this is Uriah Smith, pardon me.
Switch
Yeah.
screens.
Okay, switch screens here. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so it says here, the time appointed is probably the prophetic time of verse 24. So this is Smith, which had been previously mentioned. It closed, as already shown, in AD 330. The removal of the seat of empire to Constantinople was the signal for the downfall of the empire. Rome then lost its prestige. Continuing, but now dealing with verse 30, what were the ships of Kittim that came against this power? And when was this movement made? Carthage. Was a naval warfare with Carthage as a base of operations ever waged against the Roman Empire? We think of the terrible onslaught of the Vandals upon Rome under the fierce Genseric. There we go. Their submission to Catholicism. Paganism was actually lifted up, for Catholicism is the greatest manifestation of paganism of all time. And that's what I was looking at in Daniel chapter 8 there. The paganism wasn't taken away in Daniel chapter 8. It was lifted up. In AD 508, the powers of Europe began to wage war against countries represented by 3 horns. And by 538, the last of the 3 horns met defeat, and the papacy ascended to the throne of the world. Then the abomination that maketh desolate, symbolic of the papacy, was set up. In verses 32 to 35, we see the persecution of the Dark Ages illustrated, with the final phase of verse 35 pointing to the end of the 1260 years with the words, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. This phrase takes us up to verse 40. But before Daniel gets to verse 40, verses 36 to 39 present the description of the main subject of Daniel, the papacy. So we addressed this earlier. Uriah Smith makes this change where he's going to say that this isn't the papacy, but this is Turkey, right? He doesn't say it's Turkey. Does he say it's Turkey? I always get mixed up. I think he says it's France, right? Is that correct? Or does he say it's
you're correct.
What's that?
I believe you're correct.
Yeah, it always just confuses me. I have such a difficulty keeping his interpretation in my mind. So I think this would have to be France, the king that shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. for that determined shall be done. Yeah, I think he's introducing France as a king. So he's not having this represent the king of the north, but he's not having it represent the papacy. So James White would apply this verse to the papacy, but Uriah Smith is now introducing another power, the atheistic power is the way that he looks at it, that is France, and that France is going to be involved with a battle between the king of the north and the king of the south. And I just find it so illogical. When I read this, all I see is the papacy. I don't see an atheistic power. Just because he magnifies himself above every god, that doesn't mean he's atheistic. And this magnification is definitely a parallel to what we see in Daniel chapter 8. But what's the focus again on Daniel chapter 11? What aspect? What is it that the papacy brings to the table in 538?
Civil aspect.
The civil aspect, right? So it becomes not just a religious power, because that's what's happening before 538, is the papacy is developing as this religious power that is inheriting paganism, but putting it now in a different expression of paganism. But in 538, when you see that paganism is removed, it's not being lifted up and exalted here, it's going to be removed in 508. And then in 538, the papacy now is going to be this political power. So when it says he will exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, that is the state and the church combined. That's the way that I would interpret this. So, so we addressed that Uriah Smith has a different interpretation. And that's what Dwight's always fighting against. This is clearly the papacy, and Paul paraphrases this passage in his most potent statement of the papacy in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3-4. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So when Uriah Smith takes Daniel 11, verse 36, and says, this is referring to France, what does that mean about 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 3-4? Because who is Paul applying? Because he's really quoting Daniel 11, verse 36. Who is he applying this to?
Paul is applying it to Rome.
He's applying it to Rome. There's no mistaking in that. Protestant commentators throughout history, until recent times, have always applied this to Rome, because that's what Paul is talking about. There's just no disputing that. And the one that's going to be taken
France didn't even exist at that time.
Well, yes. Well, France didn't exist. But Paul is still putting this in the future, right? So Papal Rome didn't exist yet either. But Paul is looking to Papal Rome, not to France, in understanding Daniel 11, verse 36. Sister White combines both Daniel's king, which does according to his will, and Paul's man of sin in describing the papacy. She says, and this is in, I can't remember which chapter in the Great Controversy, it's either chapter 2 or chapter 3, but this compromise between paganism and Christianity resulted in the development of the man of sin, foretold in prophecy as opposing and exalting himself above God. The gigantic system of false religion is a masterpiece of Satan's power, a monument of his efforts to seat himself upon the throne to rule the world according to his will. So she's taking this, these verses according to his will, that's from Daniel 11, verse 36. And the other one's from Second Thessalonians, opposing and exalting himself above God. So Ellen White is tying these two together. As we continue the study of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, we will see a historical sequence within these verses, which closely parallels the history we have just reviewed. We will set forth evidence to demonstrate that Daniel 11:40 is a description of a spiritual war between the papacy and atheism, which began in 1798. We will show that France wore the crown of the king of the South in 1798. So the difference here is that what Uriah Smith does in introducing this power, which is really referring to the papacy, he's now going to give it to another power, which is France. And so he doesn't see the battle in Daniel 11, verse 40, as a battle between the papacy and France being described. He sees it as France battling against Turkey and Egypt. So do people understand that? Is that how people understand what Uriah Smith is doing in Daniel chapter 11? When he gets to verse 40? Because he introduces this king, which he says is France. In his state, he shall honor the God of forces. Here, I need to go switch. I wish I could just switch screens. I know there's a way to do it, but I have to turn this off. So he's going to look at, Uriah Smith is, from verse 36, this king that shall do according to his will. He says it's a king, even though the Hebrew says the king. And then he's going to apply this to this new power, France, that comes in. And it says, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall push at him. He says that Egypt's going to come against France. And the king of the north shall come against him. That's Turkey shall come against France. Right? So, doesn't really make much sense. And then he shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. So, doesn't really make much sense to me. I don't fully understand why Uriah Smith has that interpretation. It doesn't follow. None of it follows for me. So that's why I have such a difficult time with it.
Smith was trying to accordion all of the last day events down into his time. So he
Yes.
kind of crashed and burned in the Crimean War.
Right. So and none of the stuff that he predicted came to pass. But I still don't understand how he came to this conclusion. It doesn't follow logically. And it doesn't really match history. And
Okay, let's remember a couple of points.
yeah.
Smith was not a Millerite.
Yes.
Smith, at best, was a second generation Adventist.
Yeah.
Smith was the very beginning of the acceptance of apostate Protestant theology into the Adventist church.
Yeah.
So he planted seeds that were not of that Father Miller had cast. Smith was one that set aside everything that Father Miller had presented because he viewed it as something that was not, how do we say it? Not of those that are studied. He viewed Miller as crude. He could not accept that an angel such as Gabriel would give Father Miller the understanding that he did.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
Father Miller to Uriah Smith was an unlearned man.
Yes. And this is always a problem with people who become educated, I shouldn't say it's always a problem, because I'm a little bit educated, but not so much in all these areas. But a person can start to think that they know things. And, and we see it in this movement, not just with educated people. You can see it with people who are uneducated too. That you start to take your ideas and put them above God's word. That is, you see something and you think it's this wonderful thing, and then you make everything fit it. But the problem here is, I can see Uriah Smith, what he's doing is he's taking these events that were happening then. He tries to place what's happening with France and Egypt and Turkey, and then to say that these are the events that are preceding the close of probation. But he's caught up in the news of the day. And when we are looking at events around us today, we are being grounded in the understanding of the past. That is, we're not removing or changing the foundation that was laid down previously. Even when it comes to this event that happened with Biden winning the election, we're not, what some people would do, if you're going to make a parallel, it would be like if we took the position that no, Trump isn't the last president, we were wrong about that, Biden's going to be the last president. That's sort of the type of thing that Uriah Smith was doing, is he was saying Miller was wrong because things didn't happen the way that he expected, and I'm just going to give a different interpretation. And we can't do that. When we're looking at this, the foundation that was laid, anything that we understand has to agree with what went before, even if some of the details maybe weren't interpreted correctly. We might have had some presumptions or assumptions that kind of blinded us to it. But once those things, the blinders are removed, those assumptions are removed, we would see that we were correct. We just didn't understand things fully. That's different than actually saying that, no, the papacy is not the power that's being described in verse 36. That would be a really different approach. Am I making sense in how I'm saying that?
Could it be that we are correct in saying that we were correct in saying that Trump was the 45th president?
Well, I would say that he's the last president of the United States. But what that meant, I would think that we didn't fully understand what we meant by that, because we envisioned with him being the last president that that would be the end of the United States.
But he was the last president of the true republic.
Right. Yeah, he's the last Republican president that is actually Republican. Because even lots of previous presidents weren't quite Republican as Trump. Trump is very Republican.
He stood for the republic.
Yeah.
And that, because there are going to be those that when they hear Republican, they think of the party rather than the true meaning of what it means to stand for the republic.
Yeah. Because I would say right now with Biden, and this is not me just looking at current events. I mean, maybe it is, but my view is that what Biden has brought is unprecedented. That is, we have the media controlling the conversation, and the media is globalist, right? This is a globalist media. It's not just some little companies. These companies are global, and they're controlling the conversation in the world. And they're bringing an international standard to the conversation. That is, it's not protected by the American Constitution. And then you have, of course, the Democrats who don't even believe in the Constitution or they only give it lip service when it serves them, but they actually don't believe in the principles that the United States is founded upon. And we have this postmodernism that has permeated North America and the world. And the Democrats have bowed to this postmodernism. So you have, they control the Senate, they control the House, they don't control the Supreme Court yet, but they easily can, with the power that they have, place just, they can add to Supreme Court judges to the Supreme Court if they find that it's expedient for them to do so to get what it is they want. So my view is, if we're at the end of the world, we're going to have to see that what has begun with the Democrats is going to continue to escalate, and that we basically have a freight train that can't be stopped. And we can see this with the pandemic and the control that has been mostly Democratic politicians are seeking this type of control. Trump didn't impose this control. It was the states themselves that imposed this control over people. Right? So, I mean, Trump bought into it for a little bit, but he didn't move in ways that the Democratic parties would have wanted him to in controlling people's actions. So that's the way that I would look at it. But, if people want to disagree, that's fine. I mean, it's just my opinion. So I would still say that Trump is the last president of the United States, but not in the way that we understood it. That is, we expect it meant something else. And so the 46th president, he comes after the United States has ended. And I would think the events that we saw unfold in this election, basically culminating in the siege of Washington on January 6th, and the timelines that we have with this structure, I would say there's no way that we could deny that there has been a change in the United States that is different than anything that has ever happened before. And what's that?
What's the significant number of days between January 6th and whatever before? Is that fitting into our prophetic framework?
Yeah, so what it is remember the 100 days of prayer that the Adventist Church began on March 27th, 2020? Remember that?
Yes.
Okay, so that 100 days of prayer, when it ended on what date? Do you remember? Anybody remember?
January 4.
4th of July.
4th of July. So it ended on the 4th of July, right?
July 4th, right?
Yep, July 4th. And so that was 100 days, was 144,000 minutes. And then it was followed by another symbol, 13 days. So because it was the end of July 4th that the 100 days of prayer ended, you then had these 13 days going to July 18th, right? And 13 days, how many minutes are in 13 days?
Was that the 187,020
Yep,
something
yep,
like that?
Yeah, 187,000, 1,800, 18,720 minutes. Yeah. So here, I'll just bring up this chart here. So I'll switch screens. Get rid of this. So you can see here's March 27th on the bottom, 100 days of prayer.
I still haven't made the
You just
still
have-
haven't made the connection to January 6th yet.
Right, that's what we have to show. I haven't shown that yet. Okay, so so you have the 100 days of prayer to July 4th, then the 13 days to July 18th. From July 4th to January 16th is 187 days. And then we have 10 days of prayer going to January 16th. So there's this, what I'm saying is that you have the 100 days of prayer, 187 days, which is a symbol of from the first day of the first month to the 10th day of the seventh month. And then the date of January 6th is what date on the biblical calendar? Anybody remember?
It was the 22nd day of the 10th month, was it?
Yeah, 22nd day of the 10th month. So that's a symbol of October 22nd. And then we have the 10 days of prayer. So just even with the 10 days of prayer and the 100 days of prayer, we have these symbols. But at the beginning of that 10 days of prayer, which was planned beforehand, it wasn't something that was a result of the siege, which the 100 days of prayer was a result of the pandemic. That was specifically set up because of the pandemic. But the 10 days of prayer was just a regularly scheduled 10 days of prayer. And so that began on January 6th is significant. So that's why this event here is connected, of course, with the United States, but it's also connected with the Adventist Church. So there are some things there that we still have to delve into to fully understand this history. And of course, you also have that 13 days from December 25th to January 6th, like you do at the beginning of that 187 days. So you have a mirror, and that 13 days is 18,720 minutes again.
Excuse me, who had the 10 days of prayer there?
The Seventh-day Adventist Church. So both the 100 days of prayer and the 10 days of prayer are the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so does that help a little bit? Now,
Yes, you answered my question.
okay, good. And there's a lot to this, right? So it's not as, there's a lot more detail that could be brought into the picture, but we're just not going to do that. So we want to finish this up here, this part of this. So if we go back here, I'm not sure where I am. I think I was just giving here, yeah. I think I skipped ahead. Yeah, I didn't read this yet. Okay.
Do we have access to that chart you just showed?
Well, I can send it to people. I have sent it. It is on July 18th, 2020 Facebook page somewhere. But I can send it again because I'm going to send out these other documents. So I'll just add it to the email. So he talks about this removal of the seat. He talks about Carson.
Okay.
And the warfare with between Carthage and the Roman Empire. So you have these battles that occur. So he goes to Daniel 7:23 to 24. So he's going to address the same transition. In Daniel 7:23 to 24, we find that after the fourth kingdom arises, another shall arise. This is the description of the fall of pagan and the rise of papal Rome. So again, in Daniel, they're going to continue to show this transition from pagan to papal Rome in more detail. In the prophecy of Daniel 7, we see that the fifth king shall subdue three kings. As he ascends to power, Genseric, the king of the Vandals, was one of those three kings. As papal Rome rises to power, three horns, or three kingdoms, had to be removed to prepare the way. This was, in itself, a repetition of history, for as pagan Rome came to control the world, it first had to conquer 3 areas. In Daniel 8:9, we see that the little horn symbolizing pagan Rome, waxing toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land or the glorious land, thus illustrating the directions of conquest taken as Rome brought the world under its control. So what Dwight was talking about there, Antiochus Epiphanes doesn't fit the bill because he doesn't go towards the east. But we also have this parallel between pagan Rome and papal Rome that needs to be understood. And if we put Antiochus Epiphanes in there, we remove that symmetry. We especially note this history for the king of the north in Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, would also subdue 3 entities before he took control of the world. In Daniel 11, 30 to 36, we see that pagan Rome is waning in power when threatened by other powers in the past. Now, he talks about, so we have 3 entities when pagan Rome conquers 3 entities, correct?
Correct.
Papal Rome conquers 3 entities, and then modern Rome is going to conquer or subdue 3 entities. Is that how we understand it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is a very important pattern that Jeff has set up. And again, if we put Antiochus Epiphanes in there, it destroys that symmetry. But more importantly, it destroys our understanding of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. In Daniel 11, 30 to 36, we see that pagan Rome is waning in power when threatened by other powers in the past. Rome prevailed. Not so at this time. As Rome went out to do battle, it was grieved by its inability to prevail. At this time period, the 3 horns, which were waging war against pagan Rome, were also waging a theological war against Catholicism. The Heruli, the Goths, and the Vandals, symbolized by the 3 horns, embraced the Arian faith. During this time period, Justinian declared the Bishop of Rome to be the head of the church and the corrector of heretics in an attempt to restrain the Arian faith from dominating Catholic doctrines. Justinian's efforts to uphold Catholic doctrines against the Arian onslaught opened the door for the Catholic Church to restrict certain books which threatened their man-made doctrines. This restriction included the Bible, for they began to teach that only the church fathers could safely read it. This attack against the Bible was the indignation against the Holy Covenant, and the appointment of the Bishop of Rome to the head of the church was the intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. I've never really understood it that way, so I'm just trying to think about it. That's a point I've always wondered about. Makes sense. Verse 31 records that arms shall stand on his part. So we discussed this before. And so who are the arms that stand on his part? At least as we understood it. Clovis, right? So he's going to explain this. As history and prophecy move toward the next step in the sequence to set papal Rome on the throne of the world, we find that Clovis, the king of France, dedicated his sword and his country to the papacy. France became the first Catholic nation, the first of 7 kingdoms found in Europe to renounce their pagan beliefs and embrace Catholicism, and also the first to submit the nation to the service of the papacy. The alliance provided the ways and means to defeat the 3 Arian horns. Prophecy taught that these 3 horns would be removed before the papacy assumed authority over the world. Not only did Clovis and the other horns of Europe bring their finances and arms to bear against the 3 horns, they also took away their pagan resistance against Catholicism. That took away reference to 2 Thessalonians and Daniel 11:31 and 12:11. Speaking of the daily, Sister White states, then I saw in relation to the daily that the word sacrifice was supplied by man's wisdom and does not belong to the text, and that the Lord gave the correct view of it to those who gave the judgment hour cry. When union existed before 1844, nearly all were united on the correct view of the daily. But in the confusion since 1844, other views have been embraced, and darkness and confusion have followed. The pioneers viewed the daily as symbolizing the attack against God's truth through the forces of paganism. Uriah Smith describes their understanding. So we're going to stop here. We're going to come to this dealing with the daily again and look at this tomorrow, not tomorrow. This will be on Sunday morning. And so, yeah, we should be able to get through those on Sunday morning, because we're going over this again and again, but we really need to establish these points. So any final thoughts? It says, as the Millerites were wrong about the 45 years, which ended in 1843, and found that the 2,300 years extended to 46 years. Similarly, could it be that we anticipated the last president would be with the 45th and then find that it proceeds to the 46th? So this is a question being asked by Stephen. And I would say that there's a partial truth to this, but I would still say, in understanding the role of Trump, that he was Xerxes, we did have a misunderstanding regarding Alexander. So you could argue that. You could say that Trump was the 45th president and that Biden becomes the 46th president. And so that we didn't see that transition. So we made that parallel between 1840, the 45th year from 1798 to the 46th year. And so I couldn't really argue with that in that sense. I would still argue, though, that as far as how we understood Trump being the last president, it's not just about him being the 45th president. That's the thing that I would say. It's we did misunderstand his role. So that would be something that we would have to look at. And it became clear to me as I started, and the key for me was Tess, what she was saying, because I'm not, a person who was really interested in reading about politics. So when she said that we needed to read only CNN and the Washington Post and that we shouldn't look at Fox or other sources, I began to do research. And as I did research, as time went on, I started to realize that Trump could not have been the person who was going to bring about the events that we saw, the Sunday law and so forth. It just didn't make sense that he would do that. He never demonstrated that type of dictatorship or that tendency to be, even though he courted evangelicals to get their support, he would not have supported a Sunday law. That's my view. And that's the view I came to long before the election. So I would have had this view back in 2019. It continued to develop as I continued to study. So definitely by the time the election came, I was actually doubtful that Trump would ever bring in the Sunday law. The only thing that I could see is that if the Sunday law came under Trump, it would have to come by a deception on the part of others. It wouldn't be something that would be the natural result of Trump's views. But be that as it may, it's something that we still haven't fully addressed. We tried to address it when we were doing the study on the book of Esther, and we maybe failed in doing that, because in the book of Esther, one of the things we were looking at was its connection to the book of Daniel and Trump being Xerxes. But as we looked at the book of Esther, the thing that we came to the conclusion was is that it's a type of the Sunday law, and that in the role that we see Xerxes playing, he's not playing a role that the Sunday law doesn't really come from him. It comes from Haman. So, or the type of the Sunday law. So that's something we didn't really fully, lay out in clearly, but it's something that we do have to come back to, trying to understand that. So the book of Esther, the law that comes in, doesn't come from Xerxes, and Xerxes there symbolizes Christ in the context of that conflict in that type of the Sunday law. So anyway, some interesting ideas, and we will obviously come back to these in further discussions. But let's close with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful for the things that we have studied here this morning. We know that we still have many loose threads, many questions unanswered. But we know, Lord, that you have a purpose in how you work in our lives and how you unfold truth. And we just ask that we can be faithful, and that you can continue to give us light as we walk in it. Thank you for hearing our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.